I never thought I'd return to my childhood home only to find nothing but rubble where my mother's house once stood. It was the house my father built with his own hands, the house where my mother raised me, the house that held every memory of my life. And now it was gone, torn down like it never existed. All because of a heartless HOA that decided my mother's home was standing in the way of their latest project, a parking lot. It started with letters, the kind that came in crisp white envelopes with the HOA's fancy logo stamped on top. My mother, a quiet and kind woman who had lived in that house for over 40 years, had been receiving them for months. At first, they were about small things, her fence being too old, her garden not aesthetically pleasing. Then, the warnings became more aggressive. The HOA had decided that her home was not in harmony with the community's future plans. They wanted it gone. My mother, being the strong woman she was, refused to be bullied. She ignored the threats, believing that they were just empty words. After all, how could they tear down a house that she legally owned? But the HOA had other plans. One morning, while my mother was at her weekly doctor's appointment, they made their move. A demolition crew arrived with a city permit that no one had ever seen before. Neighbors watched in horror as the bulldozers rolled onto the property. They saw the workers shatter windows, rip apart walls, and flatten decades of memories into dust. My mother returned home to find nothing but broken bricks and twisted metal where her home used to be. She collapsed right there on the sidewalk, clutching her chest as she struggled to breathe. A kind neighbor called an ambulance while another frantically tried to reach me. I was in the middle of a council meeting when I got the call. The words hit me like a hammer. Your mom's house is gone. I left immediately, my heart pounding in my chest as I drove straight to her neighborhood. I arrived to find her sitting on a plastic chair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the remains of her life. The HOA president, a smug-looking man in a suit far too expensive for a community volunteer, stood nearby, casually flipping through a clipboard as if he hadn't just destroyed someone's home. I stepped out of my car, barely able to contain my rage. What the hell happened here? I demanded, my voice sharp enough to make heads turn. The man didn't even flinch. He adjusted his tie, gave me a fake sympathetic smile, and began his well-rehearsed speech about community improvements and legal permissions. But he had no idea who he was talking to, because I wasn't just anyone. I was the mayor, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I clenched my fists as the HOA president continued his speech, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. He spoke in that condescending tone, the kind people use when they think they're untouchable. He explained how the board had approved the demolition months ago, how proper notices were sent, and how my mother had been informed well in advance. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I glanced at my mother, her frail hands trembling in her lap. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. You demolished my mother's house, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Without her consent, without a court order, without legal grounds. The HOA president smirked. I'm afraid you're mistaken, he said, tapping his clipboard. This property was deemed in violation of multiple HOA codes. We followed protocol. The land is now part of our new community parking expansion. Your mother had ample opportunity to comply, and unfortunately, she chose not to. I could see the neighbors gathered around, their eyes filled with anger and disbelief. Some held their phones up, recording everything. A few shook their heads in silent protest. But no one spoke. They had been bullied by this HOA for years, and fear had kept them silent. Not anymore. I turned to my mother. Did you receive any notice of this demolition? I asked softly. She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. I faced the HOA president again. So you're telling me, I said, my voice louder now, that my mother, a 76-year-old woman, was notified that her house would be bulldozed, and she just ignored it? The president's smirk faltered slightly. The HOA has the right to make decisions for the betterment of the community, he said. This was a necessary step for progress. I pulled out my phone. Great. Then you won't mind explaining that to the governor's office, the city council, and the press. Because as far as I can see, what you've done here is illegal, and you're going to answer for it. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. Look, there's no need to escalate this, he said, his voice suddenly less confident. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can discuss it at the next HOA meeting. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, you misunderstood something, all right. You thought you could get away with this. I turned to the crowd. How many of you have been harassed by this HOA? How many of you have been fined, threatened, or forced to change things about your own homes just to fit their ridiculous rules? There was a murmur in the crowd. Then, one voice spoke up. They fined me for having a bird feeder. An elderly man said bitterly. They made me repaint my house 3 times in 1 year, another neighbor added. They threatened to evict my sister for parking in our own driveway, a woman shouted. The HOA president's face paled as more and more people stepped forward with their complaints. The illusion of his control was starting to crack. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice. You didn't just destroy my mother's home. You destroyed trust, dignity, and the very sense of community you claim to protect. And now, I'm going to make sure you pay for it. Just then, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. I had already made a few calls on my way here. The real authorities were about to arrive, and the HOA was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of the rules. The HOA president's confidence evaporated the moment he heard the sirens. His hands tightened around his clipboard as 2 police cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the broken remains of my mother's home. A black SUV followed closely behind. The moment the doors opened, I knew the situation had just taken a turn he hadn't expected. Out stepped the city's chief housing inspector, followed by 2 legal aides from the state attorney's office. I had made sure this wasn't just a simple police response. This was an official investigation. The officers walked straight toward me. Mayor, we got your call, one of them said, glancing at the wreckage. This is worse than we expected. I nodded and turned to my mother. Mom, these are the people who are going to make sure we get to the bottom of this. The HOA president stepped forward, forcing a weak smile. Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. This demolition was entirely legal. We have all the necessary paperwork. He lifted his clipboard as if it were some kind of shield. One of the officers took it, flipping through the pages. His brows furrowed. This demolition permit was signed by the HOA board, not the city, he said. That's not how this works. The housing inspector stepped in, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the destruction. There's no city approval for this demolition on record, he said. And according to state law, no HOA has the authority to seize or destroy private property. This is a blatant violation. The HOA president's face turned a sickly shade of white. That can't be right, he muttered. The board approved it. I crossed my arms. The board isn't the law, and your fake authority stops here. One of the legal aides from the attorney's office stepped forward. We'll need to see all HOA records regarding this property, including meeting minutes, official notices, and financial statements, she said, her tone cold and professional. Failure to provide them will be seen as obstruction. The president opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around, realizing that no one was coming to his defense. The board members who had been standing with him were slowly backing away, pretending to be uninvolved. A neighbor stepped forward hesitantly. They've been doing this for years, she said, her voice shaking. Forcing people out, increasing fees, making up rules to get rid of anyone who doesn't fit their vision for the neighborhood. My husband and I wanted to fight back, but they threatened to fine us until we couldn't afford to live here anymore. Another neighbor nodded. They said if we didn't comply, we'd lose our homes too. The police officer glanced at me. Mayor, it sounds like we're going to need a full investigation. I nodded. Absolutely. And while you're at it, I want my mother's house added to the list of properties that were wrongfully targeted. She's not just another victim of HOA corruption. This is her home, and she's getting justice. The officer turned back to the HOA president. Sir, you're going to need to come with us for questioning. There are serious legal implications for what's happened here. The president looked stunned. You can't be serious. I was just doing my job. The officer raised an eyebrow. Your job? You mean illegally demolishing homes without city approval? Before the HOA president could respond, another officer stepped forward. We'll also need to speak with the demolition company. If they proceeded without proper permits, they're just as liable. As the officers placed a firm hand on the HOA president's arm, the reality of the situation seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, the smugness was gone. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, he mumbled. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. You thought you could bully an old woman out of her home. You thought no one would fight back. But you made one mistake. You picked the wrong family to mess with. As the officers led him to the squad car, I turned to my mother. She still looked overwhelmed, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes now. I knelt beside her. "Mom, this isn't over yet," I said. "We're going to rebuild, and we're going to make sure no one else goes through this again." She reached out, squeezing my hand. "I always knew you'd stand up for what's right," she whispered. I looked around at the gathered neighbors, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up before. That fear was fading now, replaced by something else. Determination. The HOA's reign of terror was over. But I wasn't done yet. The HOA president was gone, taken away in the back of a police car, but his damage remained. My mother's house, our family home, was nothing more than a pile of broken bricks and shattered memories. I stood there, fists clenched, as the crowd murmured around me. Some neighbors still looked hesitant, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Others were whispering to each other, finally finding the courage to speak up. Then, a woman in a red sweater stepped forward. "Mayor, I need to tell you something," she said, glancing nervously at the remaining HOA board members. "I used to be the HOA treasurer." That got my attention. "Go on," I said, watching as the board members stiffened. She swallowed hard. "They've been misusing funds for years," she admitted. "The fines they gave out, they didn't go toward community improvements. They went straight into the president's pocket. I tried to report it once, but he threatened to take my house too." I turned to the city housing commissioner, who was still flipping through the fake HOA documents. "Add financial fraud to the list of charges," I said, "and I want a full audit of this HOA's records." The woman in red hesitated before speaking again. "There's more," she said. "The demolition company? They didn't just show up today. They were hired weeks ago." I felt my jaw tighten. "So this was planned all along." She nodded. "They never planned to let your mom fight this. They knew she wouldn't be able to afford a legal battle, so they pushed ahead, hoping no one would stop them in time." A fresh wave of anger surged through me. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a calculated attack on my mother, on all the homeowners who had been bullied and intimidated into silence. The HOA had wielded its power like a weapon, believing no one could challenge them. But now, their entire empire was crumbling. I turned back to the remaining board members, who were huddled together like frightened children. "Every one of you who helped cover this up is going to be investigated," I said. "If you're smart, you'll start talking now." One of them, a balding man with shaking hands, raised his palm nervously. I didn't know about the demolition," he stammered. "I just handled the fines. Fines that were fraudulent." I reminded him. "You think that makes you innocent?" His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had no answer. The city officials began moving through the crowd, gathering statements, collecting evidence, and making sure every violation was documented. News vans had started arriving now, reporters setting up cameras to capture the fallout. And then, as if today couldn't get any worse, my phone buzzed with a message from the Attorney General's office. I scanned the text, my grip tightening around the phone. The demolition company had ties to the HOA president's private contracting business. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about one corrupt HOA leader. This was bigger. The president had been using his position to funnel money into his own companies, profiting off the suffering of innocent homeowners. I turned to my mother. "Mom, do you trust me?" She looked up at me with tired, teary eyes. "Always," she whispered. I kissed her forehead. "Then let me handle this." I turned to the city officials. "Give me everything you have on that demolition company," I ordered. "This isn't over." And as I looked around at the destroyed house, the shaken neighbors, and the cameras capturing every moment, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about rebuilding my mother's home. This was about tearing them down. The next morning, the story had already spread like wildfire. News stations ran headlines like, "HOA demolishes elderly woman's home. Mayor's response sparks investigation." Social media was flooded with outrage. Hundreds of people shared their own HOA horror stories, tagging city officials, lawyers, and housing advocates. The pressure was building, and I intended to use it. By noon, I was standing in front of City Hall, a podium in front of me, cameras in my face, and a sea of reporters waiting. My mother sat in the front row, flanked by concerned neighbors who had come to support her. The air was thick with anticipation. I took a deep breath and started speaking. For years, HOAs like this one have operated unchecked, abusing their power, targeting vulnerable homeowners and exploiting legal loopholes. Yesterday, they demolished my mother's home. But today, we start demolishing their corruption. The crowd erupted in applause. I held up the documents I had received just hours before. We have evidence that this HOA president was using his position to funnel money into his private contracting business, inflating fees, and targeting residents who couldn't fight back. But that ends now. I turned to the housing commissioner, who stepped forward. Starting today, the city is launching a full audit of this HOA's financial records. Any illegal activity will be prosecuted. Any homeowner who was wrongfully fined will be reimbursed. And more importantly, we are introducing new policies to prevent this from happening ever again. Reporters threw out questions, but I wasn't done yet. And as for my mother's home, I continued, the city will be covering the cost to rebuild it. But we won't stop there. This is bigger than one house. This is about every person who has ever been bullied by an HOA that forgot what community actually means. More cheers, more cameras flashing. But then, the best part. Behind me, a legal aide stepped forward, whispering something in my ear. I nodded and turned back to the microphones. And finally, I just received confirmation. The state attorney's office is filing charges against the former HOA president and any board members involved in fraud, illegal fines, and property destruction. Gasps from the crowd. Some reporters scrambled to update their stories in real time. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. Justice was finally coming. That night, the HOA's office was officially shut down. Board members resigned in droves. The few that remained were left scrambling as homeowners filed lawsuits against them. The community had changed overnight. People who had once lived in fear now spoke up, demanding accountability. And as for the demolition company, they quickly distanced themselves from the scandal, offering to rebuild my mother's home for free in an attempt to salvage their reputation. It was a good start. But this wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about making sure no one else had to fight this battle again. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of my mother's newly built home, the walls still fresh with paint, the garden already starting to bloom. Neighbors had come together to help furnish it, bringing meals, offering to assist with anything she needed. For the first time in years, this neighborhood actually felt like a community. As I looked around, I realized something. The HOA had tried to control this neighborhood through fear. But in the end, it wasn't fear that won. It was us. I wrapped my arm around my mother's shoulders as she smiled up at me. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. We did it. And as the sun set over the street, where people once hid behind closed doors but now stood together, I knew. This wasn't just about one battle. This was the beginning of something bigger. A new fight. A fair fight. And this time, the right people were in charge.